Christian parenting. Welcome to Called to Love, where we discuss all things adoption and foster care and dive into the practical, the clinical, and most importantly, the biblical perspectives to help you and your family thrive. I'm Summer Colbert, adoptive mom, director of adoption and foster ministry, and champion for the Arkansas Baptist Children and Family Ministries. Adoption isn't just a process. It is an invitation to go on a journey with the Lord where you will experience life-changing opportunities to grow in your faith and learn to love in an entirely new way. One thing is for sure, being called to love means you will never be the same. Welcome back, friends, to Called to Love. Today, I am so excited to welcome a very special guest to speak to that clinical aspect that's going to serve us as foster and adoptive parents. Travis Thompson is a licensed marriage and family therapist with extensive experience in both foster care and addiction therapy. He has a focus on how addiction impacts systems of people, from couples to families and entire communities. And Travis has worked with adults and adolescents diagnosed with severe substance abuse and mental illness. He's worked in both long-term care and shorter-term treatment facilities, as well as the foster system itself, and includes outpatient programs for mental health and substance addiction. So in other words, he knows what he's talking about. And Travis and his wife have served as foster parents and seen firsthand the effects of trauma and walked the pathway toward healing for children who have experienced hard things. He's done in-home therapeutic work within the foster care system, as I mentioned, and worked with biofamilies to work towards reunification. You know, as foster and adoptive parents, it's helpful to understand our kids' development and what the effects of a trauma actually look like and how we can come alongside our kids to help them thrive. So with that, let's dive into this conversation. Travis, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm appreciative to be back here again.
Yes, I'm so excited for you just to have the opportunity to really dive into what can be a really intimidating topic for us as foster and adoptive parents. You hear the word trauma and we're thinking automatically right off the bat, oh gosh, I can't do this. I can't say yes because I'm not qualified. But we're going to talk about that today and how, yes, because we are called, God is going to qualify us through that. And we have voices of expertise like yours that's going to speak into this topic today. So as we're getting going, share with our families about your clinical expertise and your experience as a foster parent.
A lot of my clinical expertise came a little bit out of grad school, where I was trying to find a place where I could really care for people and start meeting family needs. And it was just a logical conclusion coming from a program of marriage and family therapy to go to a place where families were a big deal.
Yes.
So I ended up doing in-home therapy for level 3 children. I would work with 1 and 2 some, and obviously 3s turn into 4s. And so that classification goes up, but I would go in home and do therapy for kids and their foster parents, for their bio family, to do either reunification or learning to assimilate or just learning to keep your head above water. But I did that for a while and had some very interesting and loving experiences and learning experiences in it.
Sure.
But my wife and I actually have fostered for years. Even as I've not worked in that setting professionally anymore, my wife and I actually have a dedicated room in our house for foster children. It's got all of the coping skills and all of the little fidget toys, and we got the little light thing on the ceiling. Anyway, we've got that whole setup to do respite care. We also do some short-term stuff as well, but we've done longer stints as well, like 6 to 7 months as needed. We've really been the place that kids land when no one else really knows what to do with them at the time.
Yeah.
And we've cultivated our house to really be a place for those kids of any age to be able to come land safely.
That's amazing. And, for those of you who are thinking, okay, well, this conversation doesn't apply to me because I'm an adopted parent, but I'm not a foster parent. Well, statistically, there are so many children that are adopted out of foster
Mm,
care. And so, yes, this applies across the board because regardless, and we talk about this early on when I started this podcast, I hit this topic really early on because it's important that the reality is that adoption exists because God's original design for the family has in some
mm,
way been disrupted or broken. And so that's what we as adoptive and foster parents are stepping into. And as an inexperienced adoptive mom, full disclosure, I didn't fully grasp the impact of the weight of that responsibility and stepping in and saying yes to that calling. And so I want to really just be able to dive in and just kind of pick apart the basic principles of stepping into loving a child from a
mm.
family that has been broken for different reasons or another. And so, can you just give us a basic understanding, Travis, of what takes place in a child's brain and body when they are separated from their biological family? I feel like that's a good place for us to start.
The first thing is that it depends on the age. So, if you're thinking from a newborn, one of the things that we've learned from research is that children have this natural affinity for their biological mother. And so, even if the child has no recollection, even if the child has not spent a day or an hour with their biological mom, there's still a break that happens in attachment. So,
Yeah.
if we're talking about very early on, there is still some sort of distance that's created. Now, that distance can be met and worked through. It's not like a permanent scar that has to be worn forever, but it's worth noting that within the brain, there is a disconnection that takes place.
Yeah.
As kids get older, their brains and their bodies in unhealthy home situations move towards a survival mechanism, and they become more impulsive and they become more argumentative than children that are not in unsafe homes. And so those kids that you often see in foster care or adoptive situations can seem a little bit younger in terms of temperament than they are.
Right.
Kids that are in the foster system also show out into puberty earlier than the kids that are not within the foster care system. So besides just the separation, besides just the survival, you can even get things like puberty coming on earlier as well.
Okay, that's interesting. And that was going to tie into my next question of how that can manifest in their development and their behavior. So dive a little bit deeper into that for us, just so we can understand, because I think it's important to note that. I know from my personality, personally, I feel like I can deal with something better if I understand it better.
Hmm. So the development is interesting because we know that healthy relationships can step in where parents have failed. As long as it's done in a way that's developmentally appropriate and safe,
Right.
you can aid in the healthy emotional development where, you know, foster care and adoption can easily bring out a sense of, a lack of safety or wanting to make sure that, everything is hoarded and taken care of. You see this
Yeah.
with like food hoarding tendencies, or, kids will check locks and, they won't be under the covers because they're worried about getting out and moving and secrets and all that stuff. So it depends on exactly where you're at again. But a lot of times it comes from this hypervigilance state
Yeah.
where if they don't find the comfort in the connection with that either bio parent or that adoptive parents that has stepped in, they become hyper aware of their surroundings and they become highly critical of things that we might not notice or
Yeah.
mean as well. And so they can become incredibly reactive in that way as well.
Yeah, that's really important, and something that I wish I would have known, because I, quite frankly, was naive when we brought our adoptive child home as a newborn. We were literally in the room when she was born. I was the first to hold her out of the womb.
Mhm.
We took her home from the hospital the very next day, and so I had this naive idea that she was a blank slate and did not
Mm,
come with that you were describing. And I have since learned, and through her personality and then her experience in that removal from bio mom, she has, I mean, like, control is a huge thing for her. She wants to know the plan. She wants to be in control. She flips her lid when she can't, and
mm,
that is something that Otherwise, I would have, and in my earlier days, would have just seen as defiance, but
Mm,
really it was that survival mechanism in her brain taking place going, no, in order to feel safe, I need to know the plan going
mhm,
forward because unpredictability is just a really, really difficult thing for her. So I appreciate you sharing that from that clinical perspective because as parents, we want to provide that connection and nurture for our kids. And if we're feeling
mm,
like our kids are constantly defying us,
mm.
and then that's going to hinder connection. And so while we've got to have those healthy displays of discipline and authority and boundaries for our kids to keep them safe and to teach them, hey, this is how the world actually works, we don't want to give them a free pass, right? Because they have adoption or foster care attached to their story. But
Mhm.
there is that fine balance that I think needs to come through. So with that, Travis, what is helpful and what
Mhm.
is not helpful when it comes to addressing these delays and these behaviors?
Lack of education is probably the most unhelpful.
Yeah.
Because if you're working from an incorrect lens, you're going to be either addressing things that are not there,
Yeah.
or you're going to be missing things that are readily apparent. So,
Okay.
one of the most helpful things you can do is to learn what is
Yeah.
normal, what is not normal. And I know that if anybody listening here has had foster children, we all know that they sleep weird. I again, like almost every single time that we have a kid for respite or for short-term care, they sleep on top of the covers.
Hmm.
And I was so confused. We have kids sleep on the floor, right? And
Yeah.
so if you're addressing it from the point of view of, oh, well, that's not normal, go lay under the covers. If you're lacking that information about safety or possible abuse in the past, you're
Yeah.
treating something that isn't there and you're missing something, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to helping these kids, knowing what's going on is a big deal. You're never going to know everything that happened in their life,
Right.
but understanding common patterns is incredibly important. I would say one of the best things that you can do, and actually do this in my private practice, is try to figure out where these kids are emotionally and engage them in that emotional age. So you
Yeah.
can have a 16, 17-year-old that still throws tantrums, right? So I'm not going to have the 16 or 17-year-old in front of me and going, "Oh, well, I'm so sorry that you're not going to talk down to them," right?
Right.
But you are going to engage in that very basic emotional level, and it makes all of the difference. If you
Yeah.
can ride that line where it's engaging and empathetic without sounding like you're talking down to them, they feel very heard and they want to try to figure it out with you.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. And that starts with, I appreciate your point about educating yourself because one of the key components, really, to successful, I'm going to get that word out eventually. Hi. One of the key components to successful parenting is self regulation,
Mm,
right? And so the more educated we are, the more regulated we can be when a behavior or an oddity appears, with our
mhm.
kids. And so, what's a good, because listen, the resources are abundant. I mean, there's so many opinions, there's so many people with the word expert, around their name or self-professed. Where
Yeah.
can we as Christian foster and adoptive parents even begin? What's a good practical place to start to educate ourselves, Travis?
There's one word that if you keep this in mind in the moment and outside of it, you'll be far and ahead of everyone else. And it's curiosity.
Mm,
So if you're in those moments, if you feel overwhelmed or incredibly angry, you're probably not going to give the best response. And I get
for
it, we're
sure.
not perfect, all of that, right? But if you're in the moment and you remain curious, like, this doesn't match what's happening here, right? Your chance of addressing what's actually going on skyrockets,
Yeah.
right? Because you're looking at the behavior in the trauma rather than the insult that's been thrown your way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So outside of that, I think that carries as well. And that natural curiosity should play out into people that you know are helpful, right? Like,
Mhm.
okay, so what does the Bible have to say about adoption? Well, there's not a direct book on it, but what does God say about loving people?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a good place to start, right?
Yeah.
Or you find people who actually are successful. You find resources that people have attested to, although that doesn't make them foolproof. But that engaged curiosity over a long period of time, I've found has been more protective
Yeah.
than just self-care or self-regulation.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I want to encourage you with this. If you're listening and you're thinking, okay, I have no idea where to start and I already feel behind, remember that God is sovereign right where
Mm,
you are and what you know and what you've learned to this point and what you have the potential to learn. And He gives grace where you haven't
mm,
learned yet. And as you learn along the way. And so please be encouraged by that. I have to remind myself and give grace all the time. I'm like, because I get mad at me for not knowing what I didn't know, right? When I started this journey over 10 years ago. And that's not logical. That's not
mm,
practical because I wasn't there yet. And God allows us to learn along the way. So that's just a little caveat, a little snippet to encourage you along. And I appreciate that practical advice because I think that's more digestible as we're already dealing with a really big calling with really
mm,
high demands and kids with, potentially tough behaviors and big feelings in of themselves. And so we are doing this unbelievable juggling act
mm,
as parents. And so it's okay to take it in and to just basic connect, regulate, and then let God
mhm,
teach you along the way as you become curious. That's a really great way to say that. And I will say, Travis, in my experience, I feel like parents can be hesitant to parent their adoptive or their foster children in the same way that they parent their bio children, or they feel like there's some form of separation just mentally. What is your opinion on that and your recommendation?
It depends on the kid,
Hmm.
okay? Because my wife and I, we've talked about fostering and adopting for a long time. So we have our own biological daughter, and there are two things that we've talked about in reference to adopting in the future. One is we're not spanking,
Hmm.
because what we don't want to do is create this uneven dynamic in the future.
Right.
The other one is Santa Claus. Right? I know that one can seem kind of dumb. I have a personal frustration with it, but it's this idea that, we have a kid who comes in and they're 5 years old, and we have our daughter going, "Oh yeah, Santa last year got me." Okay, that creates a problem, right?
Yeah.
Because why didn't Santa visit them? So, in some ways, you will have to be consistent.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to have to be, okay, well, if this is a rule that we're implementing, if it is applicable everywhere, that's fine. Right.
Mhm.
Obviously, good things like no yelling. That's a good one, just
Yes,
in general.
that's helpful.
Uh, but other things are going to be different. For instance, one of the big things we want to do is adopting overseas. Okay. We believe, and I think the research shows that a trip or a visit to that child's birthplace
Mhm.
is incredibly healing and important for them. Right.
Right.
And so for me, one of the things that I want to do is learn the language of wherever we're going. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's the thing: an international trip with a child, right? That is markedly different because I know where my daughter was born,
Right.
right? That's not a cross cultural experience.
Right.
So, in some ways, what you can do consistently, right? Do consistently. But there are some things that are going to have to be different, either because of severity of symptoms or
Yeah.
just because of the adoption itself.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really good. And it goes back to that word curiosity and then diving further into that, becoming a student of your child and
Mm,
understanding the importance of what makes them, what makes
mm,
them unique and where God placed them originally and where God has them now. And so I think the biggest key in all of that is praying for discernment as
mhm,
as you are getting to know your child, as you are able to know as much as possible before your child joins your family if you're adopting from overseas, as you're talking about. Most kids are a little bit older nowadays with adoption programs. So that's really, really great advice. And I want to go back to kind of what we were talking about just in terms of behavior and development for a moment, because I know that we have listeners, Travis, that they started out, maybe they brought their kids home either as infants or, maybe as toddlers, and everything has been pretty quote unquote normal. And
mhm,
up to a certain point, maybe it's the introduction of puberty, maybe it is, just particular issue that the child encounters. All of a sudden, they see, um, without warning, they experience like a regression or
mm,
rebellion as they enter, say, the teen or young adult years. And I know specifically we've had families reach out and they're like, everything's been fine. And then all of a sudden, It's like, I don't know this child anymore, and they're
Yeah.
angry and they're rebelling and they're running. Or speak to that for us. First of all, if you have any insight as to why, and then how we can respond.
The lens that I typically use for this is actually not that different than I would with clients within my own private practice or even friends. Is I have moved away from the pure trauma model where it's the this causes this, causes this, causes this. It's
Yeah.
certainly important and it tells you a lot. I am starting to get more interested and focused on what has left you vulnerable.
Mm.
So some people experience trauma, but they're not as vulnerable to
Yeah.
other things, right? So when it comes to, let's say, kids that are adopted, as a newborn, they have a vulnerability that may not show out until later.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that they were traumatized when they hit puberty.
Yeah.
It means that because of their adoption, because of their separation, they are left with this vulnerability, right? And sometimes these vulnerabilities can be worked on and healed, and sometimes we just have to remain vigilant. But
Yeah.
I think everybody can recognize that in themselves, that there are still conversations or people or whatever it is. And so if foster and adoptive parents were to not do away with the trauma mindset, but were to see it as a vulnerability mindset, then it shifts from, what screwed up my kid that we didn't deal with
Yeah.
to what's this vulnerability that's coming up now. And it makes it, I don't want to say less clinical, but it feels less like you're in a doctor's office dissecting someone.
Sure. Yeah. And to that point, I think when your child experiences something like that, and I feel like just within the last couple of generations of parenting, we automatically take ownership of that child's struggle.
Hmm.
And for our kids who have come to us from hard places, we're taking on trauma that we didn't cause. And we're
Sure.
experiencing the effects of it. And so, speak to us as the parent side of, because I mean, we can't go into this feeling like, okay, we have absolute clinical expertise in this and we understand all the reasons why, and so therefore we're not hurt by this. Like, we're going to experience hurt and grief as a result of seeing our kids struggle or make
Sure.
difficult decisions or things that are, um, gosh, they're just kind of shooting themselves in the foot, and you're like, why? So
Mm.
speak to us as parents, and why it's important for us to not take ownership of our kids' choices ultimately, or the struggles that they're facing.
One of the things that you can take ownership is if you developed an environment where problems existed or thrived,
Yeah.
right? So parents are not going to cause their kid to go get in a fist fight. I mean, I guess you can, but that's usually not the trend.
Right.
Um, but if you foster an environment where you don't talk about things, or we're too scared to bring something up, or there's issues, right? You can take accountability for that. I think you should.
Yeah.
I just think that's a healthy way to look at it. But I don't think you should take accountability for something that you stepped in to try to help,
Yeah.
right? Because what was the alternative? So if you want to start, doling out blame and start taking away credit, the alternative is not great.
Yeah.
And so we have to keep in mind that, yes, we're not perfect. And I'm assuming anyone listening is doing the best that they can, that, there are going to be things that we don't realize. I mean, I might do this professionally, but I do remember some of those longer term kids that we had that were teenagers. And in my head, I'm like, I want to take every therapy book I've ever read and chuck it at this child right now.
Right.
Just so it takes time, and you have to sit and breathe with it. But,
Mm.
you can't hold on to what someone else caused.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And that ties into, so much of your area of expertise, which is therapy through addiction, and then having
Mm,
worked through really generational trauma and generational
mm,
sin. And then our kids come to us and we're like, what do we do with this? And then our kids might be curious about
mm,
their family's choices, their family's story, where they came from. And for us who only see the hurt on the other side of it, even as Christian parents, it can be hard to speak well of
sure.
our children's biological history and family. So, how would you counsel us to balance that relationship, because we want to handle that with love and care and respect. As believers, I think we're called to do that. But when these people have done things that have hurt our kids, how
Mm.
can we parent with grace through that when our kids are curious about that side of their story?
Obviously, keep up the curiosity.
Yeah.
I will let you know that it's not a tough guess to know that a majority of these cases have issues with drugs or alcohol somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
People don't get their rights taken away because they have a bad temper sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the reality, and you should engage it in an age appropriate manner along the way, right? Like, you don't tell a 7-year-old their mom was shooting heroin. Like,
Right.
it's not a great thing to do.
Not helpful. No.
But as these kids grow up, they have legitimate questions. And just like I'm asking you to be curious, the kids get to be curious as well.
That's right.
And be honest about it. Like, hey, your mom and or dad just didn't make great decisions. They
Yeah.
made one great decision, and that was having you, but a
Yeah.
lot of their other ones weren't so great.
Yeah.
And as they get older, you can encourage a healthy curiosity
Yeah.
as well. And so as long as you're regulated and you're doing it in an age appropriate way, these kids need to know that, not so that you look better, but because it is their story. And it
Yes.
can help them make sense of things that they might thought were out of reach.
Yes, exactly. And to that point, we don't want to create this space where our kids feel like they have to choose loyalties
Mm,
between bio family and present family, adoptive or foster family. And so it can be really challenging. And that's a stretch. And that's why the show is called to Love,
mm,
because we are called to love, and every journey is unique, and God is sovereign over each one. And so if we're faithful in these things, as if you've given us really practical examples and explanations in our conversation today, Travis, of being curious and being gracious and learning along the way and connecting with our kids, providing the nurture that we biblically have been called to
mm.
as parents. And I love that we're talking about this, because this is a spoiler alert. This is an episode to come, listeners. So you set that up beautifully, Travis. Thank you. And I'm excited to share that. But as we're closing out our conversation, the purpose of this show really is to encourage and empower our families who are called to love in the areas of adoption and foster care. So, what word of encouragement would you leave with us to just empower our listeners to keep going wherever
Mm.
they are in their journey?
As Christians, we have thousands of years of history and experience in
Yeah.
adoption. This is a part of generations of Christians stepping out. I mean, even back in Rome, the babies that were just left in the forests, the ones that were sacrificed or left to die.
Yeah.
I mean, we're a part of this greater idea of Christ coming in and rescuing the widow and the orphan. And so while that shouldn't inflate our sense of ego, it should help us understand that we're a part of a greater movement that's been going on for a very long time.
Yeah.
We have more resources than we've ever had. Unfortunately, that leads to a lot of bad information.
Yes.
But there's plenty for you to see, and there's plenty for you to be able to reach out. But if you're remaining curious, if you're remaining engaged, the cool thing is that applies to all children,
Yeah.
not just the adopted ones.
That's right.
So the skills that you have, they might need to be tailored, but you don't have to get some brand new ones all the time as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's freeing and encouraging, because I feel like if we're to the point where we've achieved a successful adoption, we're already exhausted from shooting at a moving target, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a process. It really is. And that's why I say early on, like, this is a journey. The process itself is just one snippet, and then we have the lifelong journey ahead.
Mm.
And so we need to be able to have that perspective that we are uniquely called to love in this way, and God has been sovereign over what our families are supposed to look like from the beginning. And so if we can just be faithful in what he's given us and learn along the way, listeners, I think we're going to be okay. And so, Travis, I'm grateful for your encouragement today. I'm grateful for your expertise. I want to make sure that our listeners can connect with you and learn more about what you do. How can they do that?
You can visit my website, TravisThompsonCounseling.com. I also have a link tree if you're using mobile. The tag is Travis Thompson Media. It gets you to everywhere. I have a book if If you want to buy it or recommend it or review it on Amazon, that would be great as well.
Yes, absolutely. I'll have all of those links in today's show notes. And I shared this with Travis before we hit record today, and he gave me the thumbs up. But as a bonus, I want to give you the opportunity to listen to my first interview with him as we dove into the topic of understanding addiction, trauma, behavior, and secondary trauma. That might be something that's really helpful for those of you who have adopted out of foster care or overseas older children adoption. And that's going to be airing soon on my sister podcast, Love Where You Are. But if you would like first access to that interview, I'm going to have a link in today's show notes for you to say, yes, I want to listen to that, and I will send that over to you. So Travis, again, thank you so much for your time today. I am grateful for all that the Lord has equipped and called you to do. Thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me.